David Vaught, thanks for joining us on the Illinois channel, and it's so good to see you again. I'll tell our viewers that you were the budget director under Governor Pat Quinn, and for a while after that, you served on the Illinois Channel Board of Directors. But we're going to be talking to you today because now you are a newly minted book author, and you told a history of your own life that frankly I didn't know about, and is a fascinating tale about how when you were at West Point you challenged the standards there in a way. So let me have you pick up the story. I don't want to tell it. What is your book about, the remaking of the American Dream, and why did you write it?
I have a very high opinion of West Point. I graduated from there. I wanted to go there. In my last year there, I joined a few other cadets who saw a conflict between our sworn duty to support and uphold the Constitution. That's an oath everybody takes. Elected officials take it, and people in the Army take it, and people in the State Department take it. We saw a conflict between that and the practice at West Point, which was a longly established tradition and requirement, that all cadets attend chapel every Sunday, and also quote unquote voluntarily donate money to it, because the government didn't want to directly support it. But it wasn't really a voluntary contribution, it was a required contribution. So we objected to those two procedures because we wanted to clear that conflict. You know, when as we argued at that time, we were all West Point graduates. We weren't like Mark Rudd down at Columbia University in 1968. He wanted to occupy the president's office of the university and engage in civil disobedience. We were concerned about our oath as officers. We'd been at West Point long enough to understand the system, but we thought the system had a little flaw in its premise in terms of its allegiance to the Constitution. We wanted to raise that issue. What I wanted to do then, 50 years later, is explore the idea of why did I do that?
Before we do that, I was just going to say, I just wanted to. So basically, what you did is you challenged the Army, basically to say you can't make me go to church if I don't want to do it. It's under the Constitution, I have the freedom of choice, the freedom of association, freedom of religion, and so you were dealing with people. Some of the names of the past. Among these people, you were dealing with like Alexander Haig, who was a four-star general. I don't know if he wasn't then, I don't think, but later he served as White House Chief of Staff under President Nixon. So these were very powerful, big ego people that you took on as a West Point student.
But we did it within the rules of West Point. We didn't skip going to chapel. We didn't engage in civil disobedience. Colonel Haig was my regimental commander when I was there, and then he became deputy commandant. He took it upon himself to disagree with us and say, in essence, this is above your pay grade. Hang in there, do a good job in the Army. Maybe when you get to be a general, you can take on these kind of policy issues, but don't bother us with this now. We said, yes, but the Constitution applies to everybody all the time. And there's a conflict when you are violating it, when we're trying to understand our duty as officers to support and defend it. A premise like that, it can infect a system in ways that maybe you don't at first perceive. And we perceived it. We want to see that it changed. And he wanted us to leave him alone. But we stayed within the chain of command. We thought, and we knew that if we made a formal written request to consider changing this without violating the rules, without violating the regulation and skipping it, we'd have been subject to discipline for that. We should be heard and we should get an answer. And generally, when soldiers have a right to ask their chain of command a question, or to ask that it be answered. You may not agree with the answer, but you certainly have the right to answer it. And we ultimately pursued that to the Inspector General of the Army, who came on his annual visit to West Point. That had never happened before. No cadet ever had the audacity to do that, and they considered that kind of a violation of the unwritten rule. But we did it, and at that point we said, okay, we've been heard. The Inspector General told us that he would make sure the superintendents considered it at the next conference, and we thought, well, we've done our part. In the meantime, we suffered some. My class rank dropped 50 points. I was in the top third of my class at the start of that year, and 50 points down at the end of that year because we got more demerits. We got some pressure, and we got some harassment, and we got some of our time used against us. And we got to walk the area. So we ran into the full panoply of what West Point can do to you if you're not towing their line.
Did West Point, did they force you out of the military because you challenged them, or did you leave voluntarily?
Ultimately, they did. That came later. A year later, while I was a lieutenant in the 82nd Airborne Division, a Naval Academy graduate hurried into court in Washington, into federal court, and said, we've heard that we know that cadets don't like this. We know that midshipmen don't like this. We also think it's unconstitutional. We want a court order to stop it. There's an important rule in federal procedure. It's kind of technical. It says, if you want to go to federal court and sue the government, you first have to pursue what's called the administrative remedy. And Michael Anderson had not done that. So I got a call from the attorneys that said, if you come and testify voluntarily to show that administrative remedy at West Point was futile based on the harassment and pushback you got at West Point, that's an exception to that rule and the lawsuit can proceed. So I testified voluntarily in that federal courtroom in Washington, D.C., and the government lost its motion to dismiss the case. The Army did not like that at all. They didn't like lieutenants showing up to contradict the chain of command in federal court. I went back in April and testified on the merits. I saw Admiral Moore, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in the courtroom with me, testifying on the other side, and numerous other high-ranking officers, and they didn't like that either. So they escalated their battle and said, we're not going to promote you to first lieutenant. Now, in the Vietnam War, everybody was automatically being promoted to first lieutenant 1 year after you were second lieutenant. So I was the only person in my class that was from West Point who was not promoted to first lieutenant. It went on from there, and we eventually had a little discussion with the personnel people, and I had applied to branch transfer to the Judge Advocate General's Corps, which any officer can do after 2 years in a combat arm. So after 2 years in the artillery, I wanted to go to law school in the Army, and they had a little conversation with me and said, we'd rather you went to law school as a civilian. And that was our settlement of our ongoing dispute. And then a few years later, the case, the government actually won the case at the district court level. And there was an appeal to the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. And the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals said, no, this is a constitutional right. It's about attendance and participation in a religious service, and the government cannot require that either of anybody. And so we won our side won in the Circuit Court of Appeals, and then the government tried to go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did a fairly unique response. Most cases the Supreme Court never takes, and it disposes of the case with the phrase certiorari denied. That's a Latin phrase. It means we're not going to hear your case, which means the lower court decision is going to stand. In the Chappell case, they said a certiorari denied 8-0. They usually don't put a number or a vote count on it, but they clearly did not want to consider the case further and agreed with the appellate court that this was So we changed constitutional law a little bit, and I think we stood up for the Constitution, and I'm glad we did. Why we did and how that all resulted.
I want to say that just to be clear, it's not that you were anti-religion. You were brought up, I think, as a religious person. You were just trying to stand up for the fact that you can't make me go to a church that I don't want to voluntarily go to, that's not part of the military, shouldn't be part of the military establishment because it's not part of the Constitution.
Yeah, I was born in Southern Illinois, and that's part of the Bible Belt. I was raised as a Baptist. My grandmother helped found a church in Burnt Prairie. I wanted to go to alternative Baptist services off post. They told me no. But the government can't require that of anybody. It's not just a question of which denomination you want to attend. It's a question if you want to attend at all. And it's also a question of, do you want to financially support it and be told that no, we're going to take that out of your pay. And if you don't want to pay it out of your pay in the military, we're going to take it out of your pay anyway. We were paid as cadets, not a lot, but they did collect $3 a month for the chapel from us. And we opposed that and put that in writing. And when you put something in writing to, whether it's Colonel Haig or General Rogers or whoever it is, and you ask for an answer that they know you're entitled to, they can tell you no, but you're entitled to the answer. Those colonels and generals did not want to answer that. They did not want to say, no, we're going to require you to give money to a religious service. And so that's why they mounted the pressure campaign and counseled us. We had a lobbyist come up from Washington, D.C., from Litton Industries, who was a military reservist, who came to see us while this was going on and tried to convince us not to do this and to withdraw our request and all that. There was a full-blown pressure campaign and a debate, really, in the cadet chain of command and among our tactical officers and among these people in the faculty, among attorneys at West Point. We stirred up a hornet's nest, and we got stung a little bit.
When you said you wanted to write the book because on one hand you kind of wanted to, I think, both record the chapter in your life and also kind of do some self-reflection on why you did it. Did you come to any answers in revisiting this, maybe some 50 years after the fact, as to why you did it and find any surprises? And then I think there's some other parts of the book too we want to maybe discuss.
Yeah. No, yeah, Terry, I think I did. I think that was my main motivation, and I didn't know how to write a book, never done it. And, you can go find out a lot of things on the internet today. And I found out that I could get up in the morning and write 500 words. And if I could do that for 140 days, I'd have 70,000 words, and that would be a book. Now, there's a lot of back and forth along that trail of doing that. To do it is, I was doing fine at West Point. I wanted to serve in the Army. My father was a World War II veteran. This was the Cold War. We were dealing with the Russians, and they were a menace as they are today. And so I wanted to serve, and I was in the top third of my class at West Point. Why did I go off on this sort of tangent, some people would say, instead of just doing as Colonel Haig and Bob Berry and others advised me to wait till you're at a higher pay grade to raise policy issues. And I found it's really about the American dream. We all pick up from our culture or from our parents and grandparents or from the agricultural culture that I grew up in, working on the farm. We pick up a set of values that influences us. And, that's what was kicking in to me when I saw this contradiction and this conflict. And I thought, and I think people were a little more sensitive during the Vietnam era to standing up when they see these incongruities. And, some of that was there too. But I wanted to explore those motivations about them and also talk about the history of religious freedom. I researched a lot in writing the book of the history of forced religion. We had a unification of church and state in Europe for over 1,000 years, where and Martin Luther stood up against that, and others stood up against that. But it was not till the American Revolution that complete religious freedom began to come about. That's a key part of our history and our heritage. And the American dream, I think, is bottom up. I think it comes up from the people out there, and it evolved based on what people actually do in implementing that religious freedom. Religious freedom, when it blossomed in the colonies in the United States, it did a great deal to also create freedom of thought. It supported the idea of economic freedom. It was very different than the feudal system or the system of the kings being aligned with the bishops or the pope or whoever in requiring a certain religious dogma. And it really propelled our country forward when you look at the history. And I wanted to talk about that, see where my understanding of that came from. And then also on the other end, deal with, you want to be in the Army, you want to be an officer, and they won't promote you to first lieutenant. You know, there's some consequence to that. And there's some disillusionment that goes with that. There's some difficulty that goes with that. So I wanted to talk about, you know, how you also recover from that and go forward in a positive way, which is the way the book concludes.
What other parts of the book, I think you say, concerns things aside from your challenging West Point institution? What does it cover, and why don't you just tell us that part?
Well, you know, if you believe in your leaders and they become mentors, that's a great thing. When you feel like they've let you down, whether that's Admiral Morrill or Colonel Haig or other people in the chain of command in the Army, it's a great thing to find a new mentor. Now, I just happened to be out there getting ready to go to law school after I got out of the Army, and I read the local paper, and I found out a guy running for governor was going to have a press conference at the old Shawneetown Bank down on the Ohio River, which is close to where I was born and raised. And I told a friend of mine who was on the county board, active in politics in Carmine, that I was going down to meet this guy walking the state. And he told me I was crazy and that would never work. But I went anyway. That's when I first met Dan Walker. And I knew he had written the Walker Report on the Democratic Convention in '68. I knew he was challenging Mayor Daley. But like so many people, I went down and talked to him on that walk. And he took he took all the time I wanted to speak with him. The press didn't show up, by the way, for the press conference. They weren't that interested in it at that point. So we talked in the gas station in Old Shawneetown, and he invited me to walk with him to New Shawneetown. And I talked and listened. And here was another person coming from the grassroots, going out there, literally walking the state, talking to people about political reform in Illinois and about the abuses of the Daley administration, really. He was in a primary. And I bought into that, and I joined the campaign. Lots of things happened in that campaign. I met Pat Quinn, who was working on the campaign too, who would fly with me to the staff meetings in Chicago, and I'm a private pilot, and was back then. He was the only organizer in that group of 18 who would get in the airplane with me. All the rest of them wouldn't really talk to me about it. We'd land at Biggs Field. I met my wife, Kathleen, the governor's daughter, who gave up her job in California to come back and help her father campaign for governor.
Your wife is Governor Walker's daughter?
Yeah. She came down and campaigned with me. That's when I got to know her. And I had the interesting experience, it's related in the book, of when the campaign was over, and I'm a campaign staffer who had known Dan Walker for 18 months in the political campaigns. I'd known his daughter a few months, and I went to see him and said, Kathy and I want to get married. And that was a very interesting meeting with a governor-elect. But we worked that out. And so I told that story of what happened there. I found that there were some inconsistencies, as often people find, in political campaigns between the reform intentions of the volunteers and the candidate and the governor. And what happens when you hit the rubber meets the road, and the legislature does not agree with you, and Mayor Daley doesn't agree with you, and there are some problems. And so I relate how that turned out, because with me being now a family member, but also a politically active person in Illinois, I thought the strategy of the deputy governor and former campaign manager to ally with Clyde Choate, who was the minority leader of the House and about to be after the Watergate election in 1974, I thought that was a big mistake.
Didn't Clyde Choate, I think, was a Medal of Honor winner in World War II, wasn't he?
He was, and it's an amazing story if you've read the story. He was a brave guy. He was on a tank destroyer unit, And the Panzer tanks were pretty capable, and to be on a tank destroyer unit and be out there with bazookas and other weapons trying to stop those tanks, he did, and he was a brave guy. But he was also an heir of Paul Powell, a political heir of Paul Powell, and over the years he had bought into the "what are you doing for me" and "what are you putting in my pocket" school of politics, and the political machine was inconsistent with the reform aims of Walker. Yet Walker's campaign manager and deputy governor Victor Grazia was saying, "We need this guy Clyde. We've got to use him to offset Mayor Daley." And I was impertinent enough to disagree, and actually challenged Clyde Schroeder in a primary. I couldn't beat him, but I challenged him, and and that ultimately led to conversations with Dan Walker, who I considered a mentor and a guy that I had great respect for. And he and I sat on my front porch in Marion, Illinois, cooking hamburgers with his daughter and his wife. And I tell this story in the book. And he said, "I've decided to challenge Schroeder for Speaker of the House." So I take a little credit for that. I certainly was an advocate of it. I helped inspire it by being willing to stick my neck out once again and challenge a person in a primary that was almost impossible to beat. But Walker decided to take that on, and that was unprecedented, that a reform governor would interfere in the actions of the General Assembly and electing his speaker. But he did. He was that kind of reformer that he would take on those tough challenges. He won some, he lost some, but he won that one.
It is interesting. There's something about your character. I mean, you don't seem like an irascible kind of guy, but that you would take on the power structure, both at West Point and the power structure within the state. And certainly, I guess Dan Walker was that too, to take on Mayor Daley and to fight. Paul Simon was Mayor Daley's candidate, as I recall the history. It was before I was part of Illinois. But Dan Walker won, and on one hand, that was also maybe part of the real challenge during his entire time as governor, is that he was always fighting against the established power of Mayor Daley and the Chicago guys.
That's true. He and I both shared a characteristic of being a bit arrogant. Hopefully I've moderated that some, Terry, and maybe that's why you don't recognize that as much as somebody in the 1970s. Bob Ellis, I don't know if you knew Bob Ellis, who was the editor of the Daily American in West Frankfort for many years. He once told me that I was one of the most arrogant young politicians he'd ever met. But you learn. Yeah. You learn to be humble. Go out and run for office and get beat really good. You learn to be more humble. And you also learn more about, the campaigning is fun and very interesting, and you learn a lot just talking to people about what they really want. It's not always why you were running. So that was very interesting. But Walker did have a period after that Clyde Schroeder battle, and I wanted to describe this a little bit in the book too, because he doesn't always get credit for it. In the history books or in the press, or didn't necessarily get credit for it at the time. He and Mayor Daley had an alliance after that in 1975 and early 76 before the primary, and they passed a lot of legislation. And they did a lot of good things. And I think that's an interesting part of the story, too. How the battle, the disagreement sometimes results in a positive compromise and result that can be very useful. And so that's certainly one of the things I learned from those events as well.
It's interesting, and I congratulate you for writing the book, not only for the West Point part, but, and interesting that you rubbed shoulders with such historical figures as Al Haig, but that for you to capture the history of Illinois during the time that you were participating, during the Walker years, that I really didn't know all of that background. I know you and I met when you were working with Governor Quinn. Before we close out, well, first of all, I guess you can buy your book at any online and different bookstores.
I'm going to hold it up.
There you go.
You've got the title there on your screen. But yes, it's on Amazon. It's on Barnes and Noble. It's at Author House, which is the publisher. The bookstores are slowly, stocking it. It's hard as a, independent new author to get the bookstores to pay much attention to you, but, they eventually do. We're going to have some book signings and events. And so that's another aspect I find fun, the idea that you go out and actually promote it a little bit and try to market a little bit. There's something to be learned from all those things. And, I really think, and you and I have talked about this on the Illinois channel, Terry, what technology is doing today with what you're doing, on the internet with video, or what independent publishers like me are able to do. I didn't have to, I didn't go to New York and convince Random House to publish this book. I had to go out there in the independent publisher world and kind of do it myself. But it's like it's another Gutenberg press revolution of ideas and access that people have. And I find it pretty fascinating to be involved in that and to learn about it as well.
When you left the Quinn administration after the governor lost his bid for re-election, what are you doing these days? I see occasionally you post on Facebook you're flying. You still fly? But are you more or less retired these days? And of course, you wrote your book. Are you still engaged in any political activities or anything else?
Oh, farm boys never retire. There's always something in front of you to do. And you sort of get that ingrained. I was involved before Pat Quinn and after in an investment firm that did quite a bit of work, and we've recently spun off a part of that that's intended to be more sustainable. And I'm with the young people. In other words, I kind of like that they wanted me to come with them to create a sustainable investment firm in Illinois. So I'm still working there. I still love to fly. I got 8 grandkids, so. That gives me good reason to fly. One of my daughters is taking flying lessons. I love to fly with her. I started flying in high school on a scholarship. And so I've always done that just for fun. And we've got a great little flying club up in Naperville where I live, and at Naper Aero. So I'm finding plenty to do and plenty to stay fun. I've kind of avoided the political thing a little bit. I did help Pat Quinn when he ran for Attorney General. I did help my local congressman, Lauren Underwood, who was one of the, she's a really hard charging, I don't know if you've interviewed her, but for, a young 30-year-old woman from Nequa High School, African-American, running in Naperville, where when I first moved to Naperville, we couldn't find any Democrats anywhere. But to take on Randy Hultgren, who's a fellow I liked a lot, who was the congressman, but, he got crossways with people on pre-existing conditions in the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, and a lot of people were upset at that. I've got a daughter that's a type 1 diabetic. She has a pre-existing condition. Lauren herself has a pre-existing heart condition, and people got motivated in the blue wave of 2018 and elected a couple of Democrats out in the Chicago suburbs. That was pretty fascinating to be a part of, but not as much as I once was. I like to sit back and let everybody else have fun with it and learn the hard way.
Well, David Vaught, I hope that we can get together before too long and see each other in person. It's always good to talk to you. I'm glad we could visit this way, and congratulations on the book. And we look forward to touching base with you again in the future.
Well, thanks, Terry. Tell everybody to buy a few books. I'll appreciate it.
Will do. Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.